Hi everyone! In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to sew this corset. This is actually one of my patterns, so if you like the way this project turns out and you'd like to make one for yourself, there will be a link to the pattern down in the description. I just want to start off by saying there's more than one way to do everything. What I'm going to be showing you in this video are some of the techniques that I personally prefer. That's not to say it's the only way to make a corset. You should feel free to make any changes that you want to make the project work better for you. The instructions, both the written instructions as well as this video, are really there for people who want a little bit more guidance or who want to see the steps sort of clearly laid out, or if you just want to see the sewing footage. So let's get started. So to start off, when you download the pattern, you should have 3 files. 1 is the instructions and 2 are the pattern. The reason that there are 2 versions of the pattern is just because different parts of the world use different size paper. It's just to help with printing. I promise the pattern itself is the same on both. So pick whichever one works for you. If you're in the US, you'll want the US letter size. Most other places will want A4, and print it out at 100% scale. Do make sure to check the test square on the first page just to make sure that everything's actually printed out the right size. Next up, you're going to pick which size to make. The sizing for this pattern is based on 3 measurements: rib cage, corseted waist, and high hip. Rib cage and high hip are your natural measurements, so the size that you actually are right now without a corset on. Rib cage is measured 8 centimeters above your waist, and high hip is measured 8 centimeters below your waist. For most people, this is going to be above your hip bone. It's not a spot where we would usually take a measurement, but because this corset is so short, that's the spot we need. Something that can really help with taking those 2 measurements is if you tie a piece of elastic around your waist so that you can clearly see how far up or down you're measuring. Corseted waist is your natural waist minus reduction, so the size your waist will be in the corset. This pattern is designed to give around 4 to 10 centimeters of reduction, but it will really depend on you. It will depend on your personal squishiness. Everyone is different, but generally people who are very small sizes, as well as people who are very athletic, will typically achieve less reduction. If you've never worn a corset before and you really don't know, I would really recommend just looking at the size chart, seeing where your rib cage and your high hip measurement fall, and using that waist measurement as a starting point. And I would recommend making a mock-up. That's for everyone. For everyone, I would recommend making a mock-up. I am the first one to skip mock-ups, but with something like a corset, you do really need it if you want to get a good fit. Now that you've taken your measurements, I'll go ahead and put the size chart up on the screen so you can pause that if you'd like to have a look. But of course, there is also a copy in the pattern itself. So what if you don't fit exactly on the size chart? That's obviously quite likely to happen, seeing as there's a limited number of sizes. In this case, there are 15, and the actual number of combinations of measurements that people can have are pretty much unlimited, right? So if you're between sizes, but your measurements are proportional to the pattern, so for example, all your measurements fall between sizes J and K, then I would recommend sizing down. This will just mean that your corset has a slightly bigger lacing gap. If your measurements fall on different sizes, then you can create a custom size. So to create a custom size, you're first going to choose which size you're going to use on which parts of the pattern, so rib cage, waist, and hip. You're going to mark the top corners of the pattern at your chosen rib cage size, the waist of your pattern at your chosen waist size, and the lower corners of your pattern at your chosen hip size. Then you're just going to connect the lines. Do make sure that you're imitating the shape of the original pattern, so make sure you keep a bit of a curve at the waist, you don't create any sharp angles. Make sure that if the original line over the hip was curved, that you're not replacing it with a straight line, and so on. And of course, you'll need to do the same on the rest of your pattern pieces. Then just take a moment to check that all of your seams are still the same length and that the top and bottom edges of the corset still form nice curves. And again, I'm going to really strongly recommend that you make a mock-up. This method is a good starting point, but it doesn't account for where the differences in size occur. So whether you need a bit more room on your stomach or whether you've got bigger hips, etc. You can also lengthen or shorten your pattern if you need to. There's a line to do this above the waist and there's one below the waist. All you do is cut apart at that line and you can either spread the pieces apart or overlap them to lengthen or shorten. And then you just smooth the curves out and again, make sure your seams are still the same length. There's more details about this in the written instructions, but I did just want to point out that if you're lengthening or shortening your pattern, the reference point for your measurements will change. So for example, if you lengthen the hips by 5 centimeters, you'll need to take your high hip measurement 5 centimeters lower. Next up, we're going to have a look at materials. Like I already mentioned, there's more than one way to do everything, and I do think that extends to materials. Depending on where you live, specialist corsetry supplies like coutil and synthetic whalebone can be really hard to get, or they can be really expensive, particularly if you're just starting out with this hobby. They can seem prohibitively expensive, and I just wanted to take a moment to reassure you that you can make a corset without them and give you some tips to keep in mind if you're going to go that route. So the first is about fabric. You want to pick a fabric that's tightly woven and doesn't have any stretch in it. Now I know that sounds obvious, but a lot of things like denim, like if you want to cut up an old pair of jeans to use, that will typically have some elastic in it now, and what might end up happening is you wear your corset a couple of times, it stretches out, and it doesn't fit you anymore. The other point is about boning. Zip ties are a pretty popular alternative to synthetic whalebone, and they are really good. You typically should go for the biggest ones you can find, but sometimes even the biggest ones that the store closest to you carries just aren't quite enough and they're still a little bit too thin. And you really want to avoid using boning that's too thin because it can end up sort of collapsing and creasing, particularly at your waist, and it's not going to be comfortable. It's probably going to hurt. But if you do end up with boning that's a little bit too thin, you can sometimes fix that by just adding more, which will just help spread the pressure a bit. So with all that said, let me show you what I'll be using. I'm actually going to be making 2 different corsets for this video, one with a fashion fabric and one without. The one without is going to be made from a single layer of this beige and gold spot coutil. For the other one, I'm going to try and use up some smaller pieces of leftover fabric, and it'll be made from this gold silk and this beige coutil. To join these together, I'm using Bondaweb, which is a double-sided iron-on adhesive. It looks like this. There's a paper backing, and the glue itself looks like a very fine web. For boning, I'm using synthetic whalebone in the 6 by 1.5 millimeter size. For boning channels, I'm using cotton twill tape, which is 15 millimeters wide. I'm going to be making my own bias binding from fabric. For the lacing and also the waist tapes, I'm going to be using double-faced satin ribbon that's 15 millimeters wide. And for the eyelets, I'm going to be using these 5 millimeter eyelets from Prim. I have a big pack because I use a lot of them, but they do come in smaller packs as well. So now that you know what size you're making and your materials are all ready to go, you're ready to start cutting out. It's written in the instructions, it's written on every pattern piece, but I'm going to say it here as well. There is no seam allowance included in this pattern. This makes it easier for you to create custom sizes that are still accurate. It means you can add whatever seam allowance you want, large or small, centimeters or inches. And it means that you can mark your stitching line, which makes it easier to be precise and means your corset is less likely to end up bigger or smaller than the pattern you're working from. I'm starting off by cutting the single layer corset. I'm paying attention to the grain line, which should face the same direction as the selvage, and tracing the pattern pieces directly onto the wrong side of the fabric. The waistline on each piece gets marked straight onto the fabric, which will help me match up the seams and know where the waist tape should go. Then I'm adding my seam allowance and cutting out all my pieces. If you're using a decorative top fabric, you're going to fuse it to your coutil. Again, there's more than one way, but the easiest way to use a fashion fabric on a corset is to treat the fashion fabric and the coutil as one layer. And the easiest way to do that is to fuse the two together. It's definitely possible to do it without, but I won't be getting into that in this video. So really, I'd recommend giving yourself a little extra wiggle room when you're fusing layers. Basically, you want to avoid one of your fabrics shifting and ending up with a corset panel that's the wrong shape. You can do this either by fusing the whole piece of fabric at once and cutting out your panels afterwards, or by cutting out your panels roughly with a little extra seam allowance and then fusing them individually and then trimming them down to size. For this corset though, I'm working with very little fabric, and unfortunately the two pieces of fabric are very different shapes, so I don't really have enough spare fabric for that wiggle room. It's fine, it works, but if this is your first time using Bondaweb, this is probably an instance of do as I say, not as I do. So what I do is trace the pattern onto the Bondaweb and cut that out exactly to size, remembering to add seam allowance, of course. I lay that with the glue side onto the coutil and iron it. Make sure you use lots of heat and don't rush this process. You really want to make sure that the glue is properly melted or it won't work. Once it's cooled down, I cut around the paper so I have all my pieces cut out of the coutil with glue on one side. Then I peel off the paper backing and lay it glue side onto the silk. Press again, and then cut out the silk. I usually give it an extra press from the other side just to make sure everything is stuck together, but the key is really to use high heat and firm pressure. And this probably isn't going to go very well if you use a fabric that can't be ironed on high. And yeah. So here are all of my pieces. The one on the bottom here, this is the single layer corset, and this is the one with the gold silk fused to it. These do both have 1 centimeter of seam allowance on all the sides. It's just that I haven't marked the stitching line on this side. It's up to you, however you prefer working, but marking the stitching line will make it a little bit easier. Again, the seam allowance wasn't included in the pattern, so you can add however much you want. If 1 centimeter is too small for you, that's totally fine. Just be careful, if you're adding a lot, it'll actually make it more difficult to sew these really sharp curves at the waist. Yeah, and they've all got these labels on them, as you can see, and that just helps to keep track of everything. And once you're sewing together, they all start to look pretty similar, so I would definitely recommend doing something like this. Yeah, so let's get started sewing. To pin your seams together, start at the waist and then move towards the top and the bottom edges. You should pin your pieces together in numerical order, so 1 is at the center front and 5 is at the center back, and you should put right sides together. This means that your seam allowances end up on the inside of the corset, where they'll eventually be covered by the boning channels. I then sew all my seams by machine using a small stitch length. Here are the corsets now that I've sewn the seams together. The exception is the facing pieces, so these are going to go on later in the process, so just set them aside for now. So when you're sewing this corset together, you're going to be sewing the pieces in numerical order. So panel 1 joins to panel 2, joins to panel 3, and so on. Panel 1 is at the center front, and there's going to be a seam at the center front. So panel 1 joins to panel 1, and the center back is going to be open. So panel 5 should only join on one side, right? Because you're going to need to get into the corset somehow, so this is where our lacing is going to go. I will be taking these labels off in a second, but I just wanted you to see what it looks like now. Before you press it, it will probably look something like this. Not very curvy or like it's going to fit anyone, but that'll change when we press it. And I did want to point out while we're here as well that you need to clip your curves on your seams. So I've done a few of these a little bit just while I was sewing to make it a little bit easier, but I'm going to be clipping these further and yeah, making more clips into them. Basically, that's because these curves in this pattern are pretty sharp around the waist, and in order to get the seam pressed really flat, there's just no way to do that without clipping in. So obviously you do want to be careful. You don't want to go so far that you cut your seam, but you do need to clip them. Otherwise you're not going to be able to press your seams. So let me get started pressing and I'll show you what they look like after. And here they are after pressing. So what I'm going to do next is actually an optional step, so you don't have to do this, but I find that the seams just lie a little bit nicer when you do. So basically I'm just going to go to the machine and I'm going to top stitch on either side of the seam, maybe 1 millimeter or so to the side, and I'm going to do that to every seam. And especially around the waist, where there's quite a sharp curve, I just find that it looks a little nicer. But again, it's optional, you don't have to do it. If you don't want to do it, you can just skip straight to trimming your seam allowance. Now that all the seams are top stitched on both the corsets, the next step is going to be to trim the seam allowance. So I've already gone ahead and done one here so you can see the difference. Mine usually end up 2 or 3 millimeters wide each, but the main thing is that it's narrow enough that your boning channel covers it completely. So if you are using a different size boning and boning channel than me, you'll need to check just to make sure. But generally I try and get pretty close to that stitching line. And yeah, so I'll trim all of the seams and then we'll move on to the next step. Next up, I'm going to be putting in my waist tape. So to do this, I'm going to start with the corset laying flat on the table with the inside facing up so I can see all of the seam allowances. I'm going to take my waist tape, lay it across the waist. Starting at one of the center back edges, I'm just going to pin it in place. I want it to line up with my waist notch and I want it to end just inside my seam allowance. Then I'm just going to move my way around the corset, lining the waist tape up with each of my waist notches. Once I get to the other side, I can trim off any excess. And then I can tack this in place by hand. Now that the waist tape is tacked in, I'm going to be showing you how to put the facings on. Now this is where it's really helpful to still have labels and to have kept track of which side is up, because the facing pieces in particular look pretty similar either way. So I've got my label on it, I know this is for the left side, I know this way is up. So I'm going to lay that onto the outside of the corset. I'm going to do right sides together and I'm going to sew along the center back seam. Once I've sewn along the seam, I clip into the seam allowance at the waist. The center back edge of this pattern isn't totally straight, so this just helps that edge to lay nice and flat when pressed. Then I press the seam open, trim down the seam allowance, and press the seam flat. Once the facing is sewn in, the inside of the corset should look like this. So the next step is going to be to add the boning channels and the space for the lacing. So to do that, I'm going to flip it back to the outside and I'm going to top stitch those channels in. And the spacing for that is just right on the pattern piece. You should have 4 rows of stitching after that, which will form 2 boning channels with a gap for eyelets in the middle. Now to finish this off, we're going to flip it back to the inside and turn this raw edge under. Depending on how much seam allowance you added, you might need to trim a little bit off, particularly if you're making a smaller size, then this seam will be a little bit further over and you'll have a bit less room. But regardless, Once you stitched that down, we're ready to add the eyelets. For my corsets, I'm using 5mm eyelets from Prim, which can be set using these pliers that the company makes. Any eyelets you buy should come with instructions, so I won't get into too much detail, but essentially what I do is use a hole punch to make a small hole for each eyelet. The spacing for these is marked on the pattern as well. Then I widen the hole using an awl and set the eyelets using the pliers. The boning channels for this corset are on the inside of the corset. This gives you a little bit more freedom for materials you want to use to make them. Since they won't be visible when the corset's worn, you don't need to worry about matching the color to the outside of the corset, for example. The drawback to interior boning channels is they can be a little trickier to put in, since you can't see whether the boning channel is centered on the seam while you're sewing it, assuming you're sewing from the outside. One option is to sew them from the inside. This is fine if your machine stitching looks the same from the top and the bottom, but unfortunately that's not the case with all machines. So the other option is to tack them in place first. To do this, I just sew a line of stitching through the middle of the boning channel by hand, making sure that it lines up with the seam. Then I can sew the boning channels on by machine from the outside of the corset, which gives me nice, even top stitching. You might want to do a couple samples before you start though, just to figure out how far apart your stitching should be. This pattern also has 2 bones on either side of the center front. The placement for these is marked on the pattern, and I just tacked them on from the inside like the rest of the boning channels. Once the boning channels are sewn on, you can also go ahead and take out any of the tacking threads from the boning channels and from the waist tape. And the inside of your corset should look something like this. For these 2 corsets, I also added an extra boning channel between each seam. You'll obviously need more boning and boning channels if you want to do this, but it might be a good idea if you want a corset that feels a little more sturdy, or if you're making a corset in a bigger size, since the seams, and therefore the boning, will be further apart on bigger sizes. I opted to do it even on the smaller corset because I was using a silk taffeta for that one, and silk taffeta is somewhat notorious for wrinkling when it's used on corsets, and the extra boning will help. Those get tacked on from the inside and then machine sewn down as well, and when they were done, the inside of my corsets looked like this. Once your boning channels are sewn, you can go ahead and add the boning itself. I like for my boning to be 2 centimeters shorter than the boning channel, which gives me enough room for 1/2 centimeter binding, as well as a little wiggle room. If you want your binding to be wider than mine, you might need to cut your boning a little shorter just to make sure you've got enough room. Keep in mind that if you added seam allowance to the top and bottom edges of your corset, that you need to take this into account. Don't include the seam allowance in your measurement when you're figuring out how long to cut your boning. Since I'm using synthetic whalebone for mine, it's pretty easy to cut, either with pliers or with scissors. And the sharp corners can just be rounded with some sandpaper, which keeps them from wearing through the fabric. If you're using steel boning, this can either be bought in the lengths you need, with the ends already finished off, or you can finish off the ends yourself, usually with metal end caps and pliers. And once the boning is all cut to length, you can insert it into your channels. Before I can put binding on my corsets, I need to trim off the seam allowance. But before I trim off the seam allowance, I add a row of stay stitching. I do this just inside the seam allowance edge. It helps prevent shifting and fraying while you're sewing the binding, And it also gives you a chance to double check that you have a nice smooth line on the top and bottom edges. Once you're happy with the curve, trim off the seam allowance. The last thing you need to do to make your corset wearable is add binding. I tend to make my own bias binding. I recommend around 3 cm wide strips if you're doing 1/2 cm wide binding. You all seem to love this method of doing bias binding the last time I showed it to you, so I'm thinking about putting together a tutorial that shows it in more detail. But essentially what you do is create a bias tube, and then you can just cut it in a spiral and it gives you one continuous piece of bias tape. To sew it onto the corset, you'll want to put your bias strip on top of the corset, right sides together, so the raw edges match up. Then sew 1/2 cm from the edge, or however wide you want your binding to be. Then you can flip the bias up and around to the inside of your corset and fold under the raw edge. I sewed mine down by machine, but you can also just sew this edge by hand, which gives you a little more control. If you want to add flossing or any other decoration, you can do so at this point, but if not, you're finished. That's it. Thank you so much for watching. To be honest, I can't quite believe how many of you there are now. I have a couple of projects and videos coming up that I hope you'll really like because I'm really excited about them. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Bye!
Totally include that. Please do. Yeah.
Much less exciting. I can tell already that there's going to be an awful lot of like outtakey.
And see how you can move it?
From a video. But it's going to cover it.
Didn't see that.